When the Draconis Combine entered the First Succession War, they did so like a tidal wave crashing against an exposed coastline. The actions of the Capellan Confederation and Federated Sons the previous 2 years had shown that the Great Houses were still capable of mustering large, multi-regimental task groups, and so it would be fair to expect that Kurita would do the same. In actuality, there was no wave, but rather wind, a widespread raiding campaign against their oldest rivals, Operations KUROI KAZE and AKAI KAZE. The Lyran Commonwealth Armed Forces in the 2820s had shown themselves to be a far more deadly opponent than their predecessors from the last war, including conducting several successful strikes and even seizing Buckminster early in 2830. Jinjiro Kurita sought to chastise them and made attacking Steiner territory his first objective of the war. Internal security force operations were being undermined time and time again by the LIC, making the coordinator all the more urgent to move the conflict away from covert actions and towards overt ones. That ComStar was the one leaking ISF activity remained unknown to both sides. When the so-called Black Wind struck at a trio of systems from each of the bordering Federation of Sky and Tamar Pact, few were surprised. But deep raids against the major factory worlds of Ark Royal and Furillo inside the Protectorate of Donegal caught Steiner forces flat-footed. The LCAF soon abandoned their tenuous hold of Buckminster. In response to these attacks, Archon Marcus Steiner officially declared war with the Draconis Combine on March 14th. Another way in which Jinjiro sought retribution was to humiliate the aging Stealths. The Sword of Light spearheaded an attack against their base on Chandler on February 27th. Despite 6-1 odds against them, the Stealths held on remarkably, before finally conceding defeat on August 10th. The forces on Moor did even better. With the assistance of the Tharkad-class LCS Invincible, the invaders were turned back on September 22nd. General Hempstead's revisions had clearly paid off. The Federated Sons faced Kurita's Red Wind. DCMS raids, beginning on March 12th, hit another 7 systems along their border, plus a deep strike at the factories of New Valencia within the Crucis March. A larger task force of 9 battlemech and 30 conventional regiments, under the command of Taisho Chosokabe Mototsuka, departed a week after the raids began, intent on seizing a trio of Davion systems. But Kurita's plans had been thwarted before they even began. The MIIO had cracked their codes using the recovered decryptor from Canard, giving them foreknowledge of all the targeted worlds. The planets in question had been reinforced ahead of their arrival, and the DCMS's dream of easily sweeping aside the defenders as they had during the First Succession War turned into a nightmare. The raids were a mixed bag, but when Mototsuka's assault force touched down at the primary objectives, they found themselves completely outnumbered by the garrison. By the end of May, the situation on Franklin and Lucerne looked desperate, and the Taisho was humiliatingly forced to ask permission from the coordinator to withdraw. By July, the survivors could hold out no longer, and pulled back, but while returning to their jump ships, they discovered their request to withdraw had never been transmitted to Luthien. Knowing the disgrace his actions would bring him, Chosokabe instead devised a plan that he hoped would wipe away the dishonor he had brought the Combine. His surviving regiments, just 4 from 26, jumped instead to Dahar, where they expressed a desire to surrender. Despite their mistrust, the Davion garrison agreed in November to meet Mototsuka and his Benjamin regulars on the field. No sooner had he been taken into custody, the rest of his forces touched down around them, and destroyed the unprepared Avalon Hussars entirely. From there, they spread out and began to lay waste to anything they could find on the planet. Word of events on Dahar eventually filtered back to the coordinator, upon which he gave the few survivors the permission to withdraw they had been waiting on. Chosokabe, still a prisoner of the AFFS, took his own life rather than turn over any information. Ultimately, the only success of the operation was Sakara 5, but it still took until the following February to completely secure it. By 2830, Captain General Charles Marik had lost all confidence in SAFE. The intelligence agency had never fully recovered from the Marik Civil War a century earlier, and coupled with the losses they had sustained during the First Succession War, both in agents and in funding, they were now woefully under-equipped to maintain a watchful eye on their neighbours. To circumvent this shortcoming, Charles began searching for new sources of information, and believed he found his answer in his sister, Jeanette Marik, the presenter of Oriente. In February, the two siblings met at the HPG station on Irian, where he asked his sister to help gather intelligence for the Free Worlds League. After parting, Jeanette called for a meeting with the Primus. When Konrad Toyama had learned that the Marik heir wanted to join the ranks of ComStar back in 2821, his initial suspicion gave way to jubilation when he realised the great potential to subvert Free Worlds League activity completely. At the Primus's urging, Jeanette's indoctrination into the ComStar Order went far beyond the typical acolytes and was more akin to brainwashing. Psychotropic drugs were administered to her in an effort to ensure absolute loyalty to Toyama, grooming Marik for the express purpose of bringing down her house. Whether she still felt any attachment to her family or home nation is unknown. When the presenter informed Konrad of her brother's request, he saw the opportunity it presented. On June 11th, presenter-rom Michel Dupree was ordered to pass along information to Jeanette, knowing that it would soon find its way into the Captain General's hands. As expected, Jeanette forwarded it on 2 days later. The Lyran League border had remained the only one within the Inner Sphere yet to erupt into violence, but Charles was now faced with evidence that the Sky Rangers were about to launch a major attack against Callison, Castor, and Graham. Incensed by the unprovoked attack, Marik immediately redeployed 5 Marik militia regiments to the planets, and on June 14th, declared war on the Commonwealth. It would be many years before anyone realised that the supposed Sky invasion was a ComStar fabrication. The Free Worlds League military launched Operation Talon on August 12th, landing on the worlds of New Hope and Judone in the Federation of Sky, while another task force departed from Altoona heading for Zwenkau. New Hope fell to the Marik Eagle by the end of the first week, prompting the LCAF to dispatch reinforcements to Judone in September. On the 19th, the Archon formally declared war on the Free Worlds League. Talon expanded with another assault on Senftenberg in late October, with raids around the Dixie salient keeping Steiner off balance. The next month, more FWLM forces arrived at Judone, prompting all but the militia to withdraw. By December 12th, it was the last of the 4 battles still raging, and the Commonwealth finally surrendered control 4 months later. Through Judone, they had also secured a valuable source of intel when a Lyran businessman gained them access to classified records of LCAF troop movements through his office on a place. Operations Rain and Sun may not have been as ambitious as Tau was planned to be, but they were still tremendous successes for the Federated Suns. With the Kuritan threat suitably curbed, Paul Davion looked for further opportunities to make gains along the Capellan front, his eyes coming to rest on the St. Ives commonality. The AFFS began in August by taking Redfield, then Stein's Folly 2 months later. By this point, the Federated Suns was busy preparing for a renewed drive towards Tikonov, Operation Lion. Their goal was to knock Liao out of the war early by seizing their largest industrial world, after which they could focus on the Dragon. When Rio fell towards the end of 2830, it left the commonality capital vulnerable. The St. Ives offensive was concluded in 2831, so they could shift their focus to their new objective. In January, they landed on Karela, taking control by April, and the Capellan March had taken another 3 systems by July. Before Operation Lion could begin, they would need to ensure that they weren't immediately counterattacked by other Tikonov commonality systems. To that end, they launched attacks on Oresha, Angol, and New Hessen, while other raids against Footfall and Wei in the Sarna commonality prevented CCAF forces from moving forward to support. Not everything was going Davion's way, however. After a thorough search for foreign agents within the ISF, Kurita had concluded that the leaks that rendered AKAI such a disappointment must have originated through their communications. To test this theory, they conducted Operation TANTO. Regimental commanders received their objectives via one of two different methods, some using standard encryption methods, while others received hand-delivered written orders. As expected, the three worlds hit by the former group faced stiff opposition. Despite failing to capture the systems, it was still a marginal victory, as the garrison on Kolia was mauled, while the fighting was so fierce on Damavang and Udibi that it rendered the colonies uninhabitable. Attacks on the other four targets caught the AFFS completely by surprise. The raids caused a disproportionate amount of damage, and despite Davion's best efforts to reinforce the planetary garrisons, the DCMS won control of Harrow's Sun and New Aberdeen within 7 weeks. The jig was up as far as the MIIO codebreakers were concerned, but their efforts had nonetheless won the Federated Suns a few years of peace, while the Combine changed all their codes. The people of the Draconis March capital understood full well that they would return, and so reformed the 1st Robinson Rangers to bolster their defence. The Free Worlds League in 2831 found itself in an awkward situation. Their entry into the Second Succession War had been rushed. TALON was only supposed to preempt an invasion of the Federation of Sky, and they didn't have the material on hand to do much more than take Aux. A raid on Sonhua to destroy the Starcore mech factory was their only other move against the Lyrans at this stage in the war. The Capellans were making gains on their Spinwood flank, advancing along the border between the duchies of Andurian and Oriente. Reports coming in from the Commonwealth suggested that Marik had time to deal with Liao first, but no sooner had the Captain General begun drafting a military response, the Lyran Commonwealth launched their own counterattack, Operation LEASH. Leaving the Kuritan front in the capable hands of Raymond Hempstead, Archon Marcus Steiner took personal command of the Free Worlds border. The first thing he did was organise elements of the planetary militia from the Commonwealth's heartlands into 5 ad hoc citizen regiments and moved them to the front line. This freed up his professional soldiers for a thrust to reclaim the Lost Worlds. LIC counterintelligence had obscured these moves from SAFE, giving the Archon the element of surprise. The FWLM lacked the materials they needed to hold on to their gains, and so retreated from all but Judonné, but not before leaving numerous booby traps for the Liberators. When Steiner made contact on that last target in late August, any hope of victory there was dashed when even more Marik reinforcements were committed to the planet for the second successive November. Operation LEASH was also slated to make advances into Free Worlds League territory, beginning with Altoona. The planet had been heavily scarred by nuclear weapons back during the Phony War, and it was perhaps for this tragic reason that neither the Marik nor Steiner commander had any reservations about once again employing such devices, as well as chemical weapons too. The world's surviving population was almost completely eradicated, rendering it a lifeless rock. And yet despite this, the two factions continued to wage war in Altoona for another 4 months. The knock-on ramification of this was that the neighbouring colony on Roche, it too a victim of WMD use in the First Succession War, could no longer sustain itself. Marik destroyed what little infrastructure was left on the way out to ensure that the planet remained worthless to Steiner. LEASH's main objectives were the border worlds of Dene and Megrez. A total of 11 battlemech regiments were spread between them, what should have been an overwhelming force, but ComStar came through for the Free Worlds League this time, and warned them of the impending attack quickly enough for Marik to reinforce the planets. The last hurrah of the Steiner offensive was yet another effort to retake Girone in the new year. Making landfall on January 11th, just weeks after the FWLM had withdrawn their reinforcements, they were able to overcome the defenders in February before another relief force could be sent. What the Captain General didn't know was that his initial recall order had been passed on to the LIC by ComStar. The successor states remained oblivious to it for the time being, but the Terran organization was clearly playing them all for fools. Toyama's goal was to orchestrate a number of humiliating defeats for Charles Marik, while subtly applying pressure on the populace to call for his sister Jeanette to take his place. Through her, Toyama believed he could turn the Free Worlds League into a ComStar puppet state. The Marik-Steiner border had essentially reverted to its pre-war state, the only Commonwealth gains being 2 planets that could no longer sustain life. Satisfied with the intelligence Jeanette had supplied him, Charles felt safe turning his attention to dealing with the Capellan probes. They had taken another system in Elnath the previous December, but before the year was out, the FWLM launched Operation STOOP to reinforce that vulnerable border region between the 2 duchies, successfully liberating the captured planets early in 2832. Watching events unfolding on the Confederation's opposite border, the Captain General started to see how vulnerable the corward end of the Capellan realm was to being cut off entirely if their 2 main aggressors pushed in from opposite sides. Sensing a potential weak spot along the Sarna-Tikonov commonality border near their existing salient, their next offensive, Operation BLACKSMITH, would see 2 task forces dubbed Hammer and Anvil make advances in that region. To assist in the upcoming offensive, the 9th Orloff Grenadiers were reformed. ComStar would again provide them intelligence on which planets were most vulnerable. The hammer blow fell swiftly on March 11th, making short work of the 5 lightly defended systems they targeted, the last of which was secured in July. Anvil, by contrast, ran into unexpectedly fierce resistance despite ComStar's promises. Orensen and Vontebren were taken after a bloody 4-month slog, but similar efforts on Gilan had already been abandoned after Liao used chemical weapons in its defense. The forces sent to Elnath won a hard-fought victory on August 2nd, but barely a month later on September 9th, Capellan reinforcements arrived to drive them back. The Captain General was forced to withdraw them on October 21st. The Confederation's quick response was made possible in part through the addition of Mary's Little Lambs to their mercenary roster. The SECAF was fighting just as fiercely on their Spinwood border. The Federated Sons had proven nearly unstoppable in their advance into Liao territory. When raids hit Tigris and Hamal early in 2832, they knew that the final battle of Operation Lion was imminent. The hostile flotilla arrived at Tikonov on April 4th, escorted by some of Davion's last warships. Those should have been able to quickly secure the space lanes, but a pair of Capellan Navy warships stood in opposition. Not willing to approach each other, knowing that any engagement between such massive and rare vessels was a coin flip at this stage in Innisphere history, the Marine Corps instead sent in their forces unsupported. Despite heavy losses, they were nonetheless able to secure the station and even cause enough damage to the CCS Jiaxing that her crew was forced to scuttle her. Initially, the maneuverability of the Seti Azar's light mechs proved a great boon once the ground campaign commenced. General Howler Greer's forces were able to run rings around most of the militia and pick them apart. However, this unit was ill-equipped to deal with Tikonov's most famous feature, its massive fortifications. The Ariana Fusiliers withdrew back into the Stalingrad fortress known as the High Kremlin, and the enormous walls of the capital Tikhograd were similarly unassailable. This shouldn't have been a problem were they able to maneuver their warships into orbit, but the surviving CCS Zhaoqing kept them from being able to launch orbital strikes. With the Davion raiding forces pulling back in the summer, the Chesterton Voltigeurs and Red Lancers were able to marshal a relief force which arrived in October, bringing to an end the first battle for Tikonov. Operation Lion may have fallen at the last hurdle, but it did nonetheless prove beyond a doubt the superiority of the AFFS over the CCAF. Spurred on by these promising signs, Davion High Command prepared for another assault. In just 7 months' time, they would return to Fortress Tikonov. And there we go, another 3 years of the Second Succession War covered already. Some would say these were the first 3 years of the war, depending on where you're counting the starting date. Again, the sources disagree with it, give contradictory answers, and often call themselves out on giving those different answers. It's just a lot of the nations would look at their own history as determining when the conflict began. You know, if they started earlier or later, well, that's when they would date the conflict from. So we're already seeing ComStar manipulating things behind the scenes, but at the end of this episode we saw the first Battle of Tikonov, the first of 3 battles for Tikonov that would occur in very quick succession at the start of the war. Next time we're going to cover those second 2. I don't want to get bogged down in the specific details on the ground too much. Just like my previous histories, the areas that I cut the most from the sourcebook is in the precise descriptions of how the ground campaigns unfolded. Though some of them are particularly interesting to read about, it would just slow things down too much and we'd never get through the history. It's already taken us years just to get to this point and we've still not quote-unquote started in 3025. As well as those second 2 battles for Tikonov, there's going to be one other major engagement in the next episode, and that will be the 4th battle for Hesperus. That will kind of end the first phase of the Second Succession War, the phase that very much mirrored the earlier conflict in terms of the numbers going around, the use of WMDs. So all that's left to say is if you enjoyed the video today, leave me a like, leave me a comment, I'll try to respond to as many as I can. Subscribe if you want to see more videos like this one. I do have a Patreon link that you can follow in the description if you want. But otherwise, I will see you next time for the next chapter.